Hi guys, this is Andrew Burgess with NetTuts, and this is Ruby for Newbies Chapter 4. In this screencast, we're going to look at conditional statements and loops. So let's hop right into that right now. We're going to start, of course, as usual, by opening the the terminal, and going into our IRB shell, our interactive Ruby shell. Let me make this a bit bigger so we can see this a bit better. All right. So we're going to start with conditional statements. And this is going to look a bit awkward in IRB, mainly because conditional statements, as you know, are all multi-lined things. But we're going to give it a go, and if we need to, we'll switch to Vim or something. Okay, so obviously the first thing you probably think of when I say conditional statements is an if statement. If you're familiar with other programming languages like JavaScript or PHP or anything else, every programming language has a basic if statement. If this is true, do this. Otherwise, do that. So in Ruby, we simply type, well, let's first create a variable. We'll say name equals Andrew. All right, so now we have a variable name equaling Andrew. So we'll say if, and we don't have to put parentheses, if name equals Andrew, we'll put hello Andrew, else we will put s hello someone else. And you can see here we get the message hello Andrew. So let's talk about exactly what's going on here. First we have our if statement and then the expression that's being evaluated. Name double equals Andrew. So if the variable string name is equal to Andrew, which it is in this case, what are we going to do? And that's what goes in here. We're going to put out the string hello Andrew, which we have down here. And then we say else do this. So if we were to say name equals Joe, and then do the same thing, if name equals Andrew, put s hi Andrew, else put s hi someone else, you can see here we get hi someone else. Okay, well that's pretty basic. And you know what, we're going to switch to a text editor just because Vim doesn't allow us, or Vim will, but the terminal won't allow us to do some nice indentation here. It kind of goes all over the place. So basically what we just did there, and let me just save this file as a Ruby file type so we get the syntax highlighting. Okay. So we'll say name Andrew. Then we can just say if name equals Andrew, then put s hello name, else put s hello someone else. And if we ran this, as we can see over here, we would get hello Andrew. That's kind of a simple example of how to use an if statement. So let's look at something minutely more complex. Let's say we have an order here, and let's make this a hash. And we're going to have the size for the coffee, and we'll just say in this case the size is medium. Now obviously, if this was a real order for something, we would have more than just the size. We would have the let's say the price and maybe the additional things like cream or sugar or whatever. Anyway, we're just going to have size in this case because that's all we're really going to care about. So we'll say if, and you can see I keep wanting to put curly braces because I keep thinking I'm in JavaScript. So if order size equals medium, then let's just say we have some functions that we don't really have here, but we can say make small coffee, right? And we can pretend that's a function that we have to call. Then we can say else, but leave off that last e. Else if is the way we do it in Ruby. If this was JavaScript, we would just do else if, and then do our next conditional statement in there. In Ruby, it's else if as one word, ELSIF. So now we can say if order size equals large, make large coffee. And we misspelled coffee up there. And really, it should be at the top here if we're going to put this in order. If the size is small, then we'll say make small coffee. And actually, as you can see, I've got this kind of mixed up here. But anyway, we get the idea there. And we'll change this to medium coffee. And then we'll just say else make coffee. We'll just have something like that. So you can see here we have if order size is small, then do one thing. Else if order size is medium, do another thing. Else if order size is large, do a fourth or a third thing, and otherwise just make the coffee. So now we can run this, and let's just define a function here. Because this is medium, the only one we'll need to make is make medium coffee, and we'll just make that put the string making medium coffee. Now where did I save this to? Okay, my home folder. So now we should be able to, whoops. Let's go like this. Let's say Ruby, and I called it conditionals.rb, and we have syntax. So let's look at this. On line 24, syntax error, unexpected end. Well, line 24 here is basically non-existent. And so the problem here is that we forgot to put the keyword end here. What they're saying is we should have had an end statement on line 24. There wasn't any. So don't forget, your if statements have to end with an end statement. So now if we run this, you can see undefined local variable make medium coffee. Okay. What we may have to do here is bring this up here. Undo that. And put that above that, because this function has to be defined before we actually call it. So here's a little Ruby debugging for you. And now if we call this, you can see we get hello Andrew from above and making medium coffee from below. So we can delete that just to give ourselves, okay, so this is what we're working with right now. And you can see we have to define the function first, but after we define the function, we can do if, else if, else if, else. Okay, that's pretty cool. But let's do something a bit more now. In most languages, an if statement is just that, a statement. And what a statement is some kind of programming construct that doesn't return a value. The opposite of a statement, or kind of not the opposite, maybe but the corollary to a statement, is an expression, which is a value, or a line of code usually, or something like that, that does return a value. For example, when we have a function here, it returns a value. In Ruby, every function returns a value. In this case, because we don't define a return value, it's just nil. But every function returns a value. So here, in each of these lines, when we're calling a function, we're returning a value. So we could say, something like message equals this, the calling of a function, and because the calling of a function is an expression, we can set something equal to it to capture the value that is returned from that expression. In most languages, something like an if statement is a statement, meaning it doesn't return a value. However, in Ruby, conditional statements are actually conditional expressions in that they do return a value. So let's do something like this. We could kind of rewrite what we have up here in this way. We could say, let's have a variable called message, and we can say if order size equals small, then we just have to say making a small. Else if order size equals medium, we can say making a medium. And then we'll just say else making coffee. End. So here what we have is an if statement, and the result or return value of this if statement, which in Ruby is actually an expression, being stored in the variable message. So now we can put s message, come back over here, and if we call this, and so we see we get this error, undefined local variable message, and it appears we are mistyping message down here. So if I just spell that right, come back here and re-execute it, we can see we get the message making a medium, which is exactly what we say here. So this shows us how in Ruby, even something that other languages would consider to be a statement, meaning does not return a value, in Ruby is an expression where it does return a value. Let's look at one more way of using the if statement. I guess we'll be calling it a statement, but it's kind of really a... So let's say, let's create, just override this message variable here, and we'll go up here and comment that out. Whoops. Message, and let's say we can do this. We can say making a medium if order size equals medium. And what we have here is using our if expression statement thing as a modifier. So this doesn't require all the usual grammar of having an end keyword, etc. We can just use it as just to modify any single line of code. It doesn't have to be assigning a variable like this. It could be calling a function. And anything that we want to do, any expression that we want to execute, can be modified with something like this, where we say if order size equals medium, or whatever your if statement may be, whatever your conditional statement or expression may be, you only execute it if this returns true. So that's a kind of a neat way of using if that most other languages don't have. So now, if doesn't always look so pretty as we have here. For example, this reads in almost English, if order size equals medium. That's pretty close to English. However, let's switch to JavaScript here for a second, and let's say we have var, let's say, I don't know, we'll say engine off equals true. So let's say we want to only, let's say we do something like this. If engine off, and actually let's switch this to engine on, excuse me. So if engine on, then we don't want to do something. So we can say do nothing, nothing. Then we say else, and we could call the service engine function. What I'm writing here is JavaScript and Ruby half and half. But anyway, this is kind of pseudocode. You get the idea. If the engine is on, we don't do anything. Otherwise, we do this. The smarter way to do this, if we were writing JavaScript, would be to say, put an exclamation point at the beginning there to say, if the engine is not on, or if not engine on, service engine. And this doesn't read quite as nicely. And of course, this would be exactly the same in Ruby. All we would have to do to turn this into Ruby would be to delete that. And now we have an add end. If not engine on, service engine, which doesn't really look too pretty. So let's actually take away this var keyword here to turn this into pure Ruby. And let's do one more thing up here. Def, we'll say service engine, and we can just put s servicing engine. And now if we run this in Ruby, you can see we get absolutely nothing because engine on is true, and so service engine does not get run. However, in this, so the whole point of this was to say that if not engine on isn't really a pretty way of writing this. So Ruby has something else. We can use unless. This is pretty cool because I don't know of any other programming language that does this. And really, it just adds a little kind of, it's almost like sugar, you don't really need it, like syntactical sugar. There's hardly any reason you couldn't do if not engine on. But Ruby adds an unless statement, or an unless conditional, which will just give you the opposite of if, and and it's just much easier to read. So unless engine on, service engine. So it's obvious that if the engine is on, we won't service the engine, and you don't even have to look twice. And of course this can take else statements just like anything else. So we can say, in here we can put rev up engine because the engine is on. So now if we execute this, you can see we get rev up engine because unless engine on is true. So unless this is true, do this, which means if it is false, do this, right? And so because it is true, we skip to the else statement and put rev up the engine. Now, else if doesn't exist when you're using unless. You can't do unless else, something, nothing like that. If you want to do something like that, you'd have to be nesting unless statements inside your else statement. So it isn't like a full replacement for if in that way, because there's no else if. However, like else if, we can do this. Let's change this to put, actually no, we'll put, so here, actually let's do this. We'll do it this way. We'll say service engine unless engine on. And that is really pretty close to real English. Service the engine unless the engine is on. It's that simple. And of course, if we ran this, we would not get anything because engine on is true, and so we don't run service engine. All right, that's pretty cool. Let's move on now to something a bit more complex. You know, probably, if you're familiar with any other programming language, that most of the programming languages have a switch case operator or a switch case statement, which allows you to kind of, it's an alternative to doing if, else if, else if, else if. You just have to do case and when, and I'm giving away the Ruby syntax here, but in JavaScript it's switch on your expression. For this case, do this. For this case, do this, etc. So let's look at how that works in Ruby right now. We're going to give, say, like a time of day greeting kind of thing. So let's have an hour variable here, and we're going to say hour equals, in this case, we'll say it's 15 o'clock, which is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So the way this works is we say case, and then we say when, we can say hour is, we'll say when it's less than 12. We can do put s good morning. Then we can say when hour is greater than 12 and hour is less than, we'll say 17, which is 5 o'clock in the afternoon. We'll put good afternoon. And then we'll say else, because that'll mean anything after 17 o'clock. We'll put good evening. And then, of course, we end. So this is the case statement. And you can see we have 3 cases here: when hour is less than 12, when hour is between 12 and 17, and else, meaning when hour is after 17. So if we came over here and ran that, as you can see, we get good afternoon because we've set hour to 15 o'clock. Now, of course, just like we could do with the if statement, I could say message equals this, and I could get rid of these put statements. And now if we come right down here to the bottom and we put message, we should get the same thing. As you can see here, good afternoon, very similarly to what we've just had. But in this case, we're storing the returned value of this case statement, or really a case expression, into the message variable, and then we're just putting out that message variable. And of course, you can have as many when statements as you'd like. And really, this is very much the same as doing if, else if, else if, else if, as we already mentioned. Now, there's something else about conditional statements that I haven't really mentioned yet. If this was JavaScript, and actually this doesn't hold for the case statement, but for something up here like our if-else statement, we would have each of the kind of blocks of code that we execute for each conditional statement would be wrapped in curly braces, and the else block would be wrapped in curly braces as well. That's not the case here in Ruby. Now, Ruby is not like other languages such as Python in that it's dependent on white space, although in this case it may seem like it's dependent on white space because you have to make that line break for it to understand that. For example, if we took out these line breaks, if we went like that, and like that, and like that, and whoops, and like that, this would not be valid Ruby code. We could not do that. So what can we do here? Well, there are a number of things. Basically, Ruby would consider anything between these two lines to be code. So what you could do, is put a semicolon at the end of each line. And you're probably thinking, wait a second, I thought we don't put semicolons at the end of each line, which I have done in all these cases out of habit because I write JavaScript a little more often than Ruby. So the thing about semicolons is that Ruby does not require semicolons at the end of a line because it considers each statement or expression to end at the end of the line if there's no semicolon there. However, if you want to put multiple statements or expressions on a single line, you use a semicolon to separate them in most cases. So what we could do here, we'll use our case statement at the end here as an example. If I just joined up these lines like this, and we tried to execute this here, and let me clear the console there, you can see we have a whole bunch of error going on here. If I put a semicolon after the end of each of these statements, being the kind of conditions here, when our and else there, and ran it, you can see it runs fine. Good afternoon. So this shows us that Ruby's considering basically anything between this statement here, when hours less than 12, and this one here, when hours greater than 12 and less than 17, to be something that should be executed when hours less than 12. However, this looks kind of weird if you're used to JavaScript because it kind of breaks the relationship. I don't know, this is the way I think about it anyway. A semicolon seems to be the end of your statement or expression, meaning whatever's next is really pretty unrelated. However, in this case, there is something related. It's all the content that goes, or all the code that's going to be executed if this turns out to be true. So what you can do, instead of a semicolon, is use the then keyword. And I'll do that here as well. Then. And this is all part of Ruby's English behavior. When hours less than 7, then do this, then do that, then do that. And as you can see here, if we execute that, and I'm sorry, you do not need then after else. It all executes fine. So just to kind of recap what we just talked about there, line breaks are an alternative to semicolons. Ruby still needs some way to distinguish between statements and between each statement or expression and the next statement or expression, and it does so usually by line breaks. If you want to bunch them up, you use a semicolon. And in some cases like this, we can see when this is true, then do this. And this then keyword would work perfectly fine right here. So I could say then, and then join those lines there. I could say then, and join those lines there. And of course, I don't need that there because that's the else statement. So see here in our if, else if statement, then works exactly the same. And of course, we could do that up here as well. All right. There's kind of one more conditional thing we could talk about here, and that's just what you may know as the ternary operator, or more properly called the conditional operator, which is pretty much the same in any language. And it's basically this. If you put the condition in parentheses, then here we should have a question mark, and then we have what's executed if it's true, and what's a colon, and then what's executed if it's false. And these are just a single statement or expression here. You can't use a semicolon and bunch things up. Often in JavaScript, Often in programming, this is used when really there's just two options for a specific place. So instead of using a whole if statement to set which one you want, you can just use a conditional operator like this. And if we run this right now, you can see true gets put because the condition here is true. And if we change it to false, false gets put because the condition is false. Okay, let's move on to loops. Now, in most programming languages, the most common loop is the for loop. And I'm sure you're familiar in JavaScript how we'd go for var I equals 0 while I is less than array dot length I plus plus, and then in your curly brackets you'd have all your code. However, in Ruby, and I'm sure you're starting to figure out that Ruby is not your normal programming language. In Ruby, you don't use that style of for loop very often. And we're going to discuss, right now, we're going to discuss two of the loops, actually three, I'm sorry, of the looping statements that are kind of in the Ruby core language. And then next time, we're going to discuss iterators and blocks, which are kind of a very special form of loops that are somewhat, I won't say they're special to Ruby only, but they're not very common, especially like you won't find that in JavaScript or PHP, which are probably what you, if you're familiar with another programming language, that's probably what it is. So let's talk about the loops that we're going to discuss right now. First one is the while loop. And if you've done any programming at all, you're probably already familiar with how the while loop works. Basically, while something is true, we'll continue to execute what's inside the loop until that's false. So often this is done, let's say we have an array of names here. We'll say John, George, Paul, Ringo, something like that. Okay, so then we can say, then we'll just have another variable here, I, for iterating over it. And we'll say while array I, so while there is something in array, do, and that's required there, what are we going to do? We'll put array I, end. Right, like that. So now if we come execute here, whoa. And as you can see, we're just getting John repeatedly. So I'm going to kill that. Now, if you think about this for a second, what's the problem here? The problem here is that we are never incrementing I. So after this, we're going to say I plus equals 1, which in Ruby means the plus equals operator adds 1 to I. It's also, it's basically the same thing as saying I equals I plus 1. You may wonder why I am not doing the I plus plus, and I do not believe, that is supported in Ruby. So now, if we, let's clear this, and if we say Ruby conditional here, you can see we have, ignoring the first two lines, which come from our previous code, George, John, Paul, and Ringo. And the reason Paul and Ringo are shown up as 1 there is because we don't have a comma between them here, so it just concatenated those strings into one word. So now, there we go. We have Paul and Ringo on their own lines. John, George, Paul, Ringo. All right, so that's your basic while loop. Now, suffice it to say right now that you'll never use a while loop as we've just done here in Ruby, because there are better ways in Ruby to iterate over each item in an array. However, that's going to be something we're going to look at next week or next time, so for now we'll just stick with this. Okay, so that's your basic while loop. Now, we could have done this in a more simple way by going like this, because we can use the while loop as a modifier similar to how we already did with the if and unless statements. So let's do this. Let's put array I, then we'll say while array I, and actually what I'm going to do here is array I plus equals 1. And I'm going to change that from 0 to -1. I think this is going to work. I'm not sure, but basically, and we're just going to delete that here. The idea is that you can use while just if you've got a one-line loop, you can use while as a modifier and say do this while this is true, which is a bit more Englishy as well, of course. Now, the problem here is that we need to increment our variable inside our loop as well, so that's why we had two lines there. And in another language that supported the plus plus operator, it'd be easy because just do I plus plus, and after it uses I, it'll increment it by 1. However, we're going to try this, and I think it's probably going to evaluate what this whole expression here is. I plus equals 1, so it's going to add 1 to I and then look at I in the array. So that's why I'm setting I to minus 1 to offset how this is going to add 1 to it to start with. So let's give this a try, and there you can see that works. We have John, George, Paul, Ringo, and you know what, I'm just going to comment this out here so we don't have this stuff in our way anymore. But we have John, George, Paul, and Ringo, and so you can see that's how we can use the while loop as a modifier and have it just as a single loop. Okay, now Ruby has the unless statement as an alternative to the if statement. Ruby also has something that is an alternative to the while statement, and that is an until loop. So what we could do here is, let's do something a bit different. In this case, we're going to let's just use some numbers here. So we're going to say x equals, or no, let's say we'll say days left in the week equals 7, and then we can just say until days left equals 0, we can put out there are still 7 minus, no, we can say there are still days left in the week. And this is a kind of poor example. And then, of course, in here we're going to have to say days left minus equals 1. And now you can see we have, there are still 7 days left, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 0, 2, 1, but we never get there are still 0 days left in the week because we're only doing it until days left equals 0. And when days left equals 0, this will equal true, and we only do it until that's true. Basically, it's like saying, wow, this is false. So that's kind of the alternative to what we have here, or what we have in the while loop. And of course, we could use the until statement as a modifier as well. So let's think of something here. We can just put hello, and then we'll just have up here, actually, we'll just say x equals 4, then put hello x minus 1, or no, x minus equals 1 until x equals 0. And if we do that, you can see hello 3, 2, 1, 0. So we use the until statement as a modifier. Now, I said earlier that we can only use this with a single line statement. And that's how you're going to use it in most cases, but Ruby does have some nice little syntax that allows you to use multiple lines. So what we could do is go like this. Let's say begin, and that is how, then we say puts, and we could get rid of, no, let's undo that. Basically, in this case, we'll just say x minus 1, so that we're not actually incrementing it, we're just putting x minus 1 in there. And then on the next line here, we will say x minus equals 1, and then we say end, and then we'll join these lines and get rid of that. So you can see we have begin, we'll put out our statement, have a second line in the code here to increment our variable, or decrement our variable, and then end, and we're going to loop that until x equals 0. And so, excuse me, now if we run this, you can see here we have the same thing, and we can use multiple lines. So that's kind of handy. Okay, so we've looked at the while loop and the until loop. Let's look at a for loop. Now, we don't have the for loop in the way you would think of, but the way the for loop works is a for in loop, or some languages would call it a for each loop. However, eaching or each is something else in Ruby, so we're not going to talk about that today, but the for in loop. We're going to use this array of names we have up here, and we could just say, we could say for name in names, puts name end. And as if we run this, you can see names is undefined because we called that array. That was the problem. But now if we run this, you can see right down at the bottom here, we have John, George, Paul, and Ringo. And that is coming from this for in statement right here. So name here is going to, each time we loop over it, it is going to get the value for the current item in the array. So we're looping over each item in an array, and we can use it however we want inside the loop. If this were a hash, so let's create a hash here. What can we do for a hash? We'll say, just call it hash. And we will say, we'll just make like a person here. We'll say name is Joe, age is 30, and then we can say job is plumber. And what we can do down here in our loop is say key and val. So we can, and these obviously can be whatever names you want here, but if we use key, comma, val, key will get the key that the current item is, and val will get the value for it. So now we can, in here we could put, we could say, key is val, and now when we do this, the problem here is that we forgot to close our hash up there. However, if we do it normally, you can see we have, and the problem, sorry, we got to change that to hash as well. So now, if we do this, you can see we have name is Joe, age is 30, job is plumber. So that is all we've got to cover today. We've covered quite a few things, and that is our Ruby lesson for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. So let's talk about exactly what we've looked at today. In review, we talked about the conditional statements, which are else, if, and else all go together. We also talked about unless, which is the opposite of if, and we've talked about case, which is kind of like a switch statement. In other languages, we have case and when. The difference, which we didn't talk about in the when we talked about the case statement, is that with a switch statement in JavaScript or some other language, you only have one value. So you would say, switch on name, and then say when that's equal to Andrew, do this. When it's equal to Joe, do this, etc. With our case when statement, we don't have any kind of a top level expression that we're then giving multiple evaluating options for, if you will. We can make it the cases, whatever arbitrary unrelated cases we want. And then, of course, we talked about the conditional operator, also known as the ternary operator. We also talked about loops today. We talked about the while loop and the until loop and the for in loop. And don't forget, the while loop, until loop, if statement, else statement, if statement and unless statement, all of those can be used as modifiers where you put them at the end of the line. And as we saw at the end there, you could use the begin and end keywords to create a kind of a block, but I wouldn't recommend doing that just because it doesn't look very good and it's kind of a bit harder to read. If you need multiple lines, just do a normal loop or conditional statement. No need to do anything weird and put it at the end. Alright, so now let's talk about our Ruby resource. This is the part where I will point out a usually free Ruby resource for you to check out. And this time, I'm going to recommend that you go check out The Ruby Show. This is a podcast which is pretty much weekly. It's hosted by Jason Cipher and Peter Cooper, and you can find it at 5by5.tv/Ruby Show. 5by5 is a podcasting network put on by Dan Benjamin, and honestly, it is some of the best material you'll find on the web. They've got all kinds of different topics, usually. A lot of them are more technical things. For example, they've got a show on audio and video recording, and they've got the dev show. They've got the Ruby show. They've got one on iOS, etc. But they also have some other stuff like just a show called The Conversation, which is really cool, and the talk show by Dan Benjamin and John Gruber himself. Um, and that was basically a whole plug for 5 by 5, which was completely unintentional, but they've got really great stuff and you should check it out. But the main thing to look at today, of course, is the Ruby show, which is just, they'll talk about all the latest kind of news and really interesting links or tutorials that have kind of shown up recently in the Ruby community. It's a great place to kind of keep on top of everything that's going on in the Ruby world and to find some neat tutorials and articles that you can learn from. Well, that's the end of Ruby for Newbies for today. I hope you've enjoyed our screencast, and if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up in the comments. Thanks for watching.